On August 5th, 2019, Frank James uploaded a video traveling to New York. James was 59 years old at the time. He was born in the Bronx, but over the decades he had moved constantly, living in different cities across the country. And during those years, he recorded himself frequently. He ran a YouTube channel under the name Prophet of Truth. Sometimes he referred to himself as the Prophet of Doom. And over the years, he uploaded a vast public archive of long, unstructured videos. He talked about race, the mental health system, and society at large. The titles of his uploads were direct. His recordings were filled with violent comments about population reduction and notorious killers. In January 2022, James saved an audio recording on his phone. In it, he said if a 60-something-year-old Frank James appeared in the news, chances are that's me. Records trace his preparation back several years. He purchased a specific model of smoke grenade in 2017, and then bought more of that same model in 2019. In October of that year, he purchased 9mm ammunition. In May 2021, he brought a yellow construction hard hat. By the spring of 2022, his searches increasingly centered on New York City's transit system. In late March and early April, he ran Google searches for terms like MTA, New York, transit, and stops on the N train. He also searched for a specific address near the Kings Highway subway system in Brooklyn. Surveillance video and cell site recordings show that James made 3 practice runs through the subway systems on March 31st, April 1st, and April 9th. On April 11th, James rented a U-Haul van in Philadelphia, and during the early hours of the following morning, he drove to Brooklyn. He parked the U-Haul van near the Kings Highway station. At approximately 6:12 a.m., surveillance footage recorded James leaving the van near Kings Highway with a backpack in one hand and a rolling bag in the other. He wore an orange reflective jacket, a yellow hard hat, and a surgical mask, and altogether, the clothing resembled a maintenance uniform. Shortly before 8:26 a.m., he was sitting in the rear of a second car of a Manhattan-bound train. The train was packed with people ranging in age, from teenagers on their way to school to adults in their 60s heading to work. As the train pulled out of 59th Street, it entered a long express run toward 36th Street. There were no stops in between, leaving the train isolated in the dark tunnel for several minutes. Whenever someone tried to sit near him, James told him the seats were wet. This kept riders away from his end of the car and concentrated more passengers on the opposite end. Somewhere in the tunnel between the two stations, the train temporarily stalled. James reached into his bag and pulled out a gas mask. Strapping it over his face, he opened 2 smoke devices and threw them on the floor of the train car. Dense smoke quickly filled the enclosed car. Passengers began coughing and moving toward the doors between the cars. Then James pulled out a 9mm Glock 17 handgun from his bag and aimed it at the clustered passengers. James fired repeatedly, discharging at least 32 rounds before the weapon jammed. He was carrying 2 additional fully loaded extended magazines containing another 72 rounds. 10 people were shot, 19 others were treated for smoke inhalation and injuries suffered during the escape. But despite all that, no one was actually killed. The train eventually pulled into the 36th Street station. The heavy doors slid open, and the smoke inside the train spilled out onto the platform. Terrified, bleeding passengers poured out of the train car People collapsed onto the concrete. Commuters who had been waiting for their train rushed forward to help, using their own clothing to tie tourniquets for the bleeding strangers. And in the middle of the confusion, Frank James removed his reflective jacket and hard hat. He dropped his bags on the floor of the train car, and he walked down to the chaotic platform, crossed the platform and boarded an R train, waiting on the opposite of the in train. As he rode away, about 15 minutes later, he exited the subway at the 25th Street station. He caught a city bus heading toward Park Slope. He would buy a new surgical mask to change his appearance. And by 9:18 a.m., he walked back underground and swiped into the subway system again at 7th Avenue, continually moving through the city and repeatedly changing his clothing. Behind him, Sunset Park was swarming with emergency vehicles. Service on several Brooklyn transit lines were suspended as heavily armed officers searched the tunnels. But they also faced another problem. Cameras at the 25th, 36th, and 45th Street stations had failed to transmit footage. And now investigators are forced to rely entirely on passenger recordings and other surveillance cameras along James's route. Down in the abandoned in-train car, they found a jammed handgun, the extended magazines, a hatchet, fireworks, a container of gasoline, and 2 unused smoke devices. They also found a bank card and a key to a U-Haul van. The key initially connected James to the rental, making him a person of interest before authorities publicly identified him as a suspect. Police located the U-Haul parked near the Kings Highway, exactly where it had been left. And by Tuesday afternoon, after investigators ran his name, they uncovered the Prophet of Truth YouTube channel. The digital archive he'd spent years building was suddenly everywhere. News networks broadcast his face and clips from his videos. YouTube would eventually terminate the channel, but by then, copies of the videos were already circulating. A citywide manhunt stretched through Tuesday night and into Wednesday morning. The NYPD received a flood of tips, but James remained missing. And then around noon on Wednesday, the Crime Stoppers tip line received a call. According to law enforcement sources, the caller identified himself as Frank James. He told the operator that he saw his face on the news, knew he was wanted, and was currently at a McDonald's on the East Village of Manhattan. Officers responded to the McDonald's, but James was no longer there. But he was still in the neighborhood, just walking down the sidewalk. And people were starting to notice him. A man recognized James and flagged down nearby officers. Many other civilians recognized him and dialed 911. And in total, 5 members of the public officially provided information on his whereabouts. Officers found James walking near St. Mark's Place and 1st Avenue. And when they caught him, he didn't run. He just raised his hands and was arrested without incident. This was all roughly 29 hours after the first shots were fired. The legal resolution took time, and the question of his exact intent became the central dispute. On January 3rd, 2023, James pleaded guilty to all 11 federal counts, 10 counts of committing a terrorist attack, 1 for each person he shot, and 1 count of discharging a firearm during the attack. He admitted in court that he intended to cause serious bodily harm. Of course, prosecutors strongly disagreed. He had brought 72 additional rounds onto the train with him, and it was very clear that his intention was to kill. When given the chance to speak, James told the judge, "I alone am responsible, and no one else for the attack," adding that the passengers had done nothing wrong and did not deserve what happened to them. On October 5th, 2023, he received 10 concurrent life sentences, plus a consecutive 10-year sentence. Even after the sentence, one question remained unsolved. Why did Frank James do it? James never provided one clear or consistent answer. During the sentencing, he insisted the attack had nothing to do with race, creed, color, or sexual orientation. Instead, he described it as an attempt to shine light on conditions in the city where he had grown up. He criticized the mental health system and argued it had failed people like him. But even through that explanation, it doesn't really make much sense. If you look through the online archive that James had created, it does not match up. His videos did more than criticize mental health treatment. He praised notorious killers including Ted Bundy, spoke about reducing human population. On Facebook, he reportedly described wanting to murder people. But whatever the actual motive really was, it remains only known to Frank James. But for years, he'd been telling a small online audience that society was collapsing, that people needed to die, and that one day, his name might appear in the news. And on April 12, 2022, it finally did. At 9:15 p.m. on March 13, 2019, a pickup truck arrived at Hilltop Terrace in the Tote Hill neighborhood of Staten Island. Tote Hill sits at the highest natural point in New York City. It is a quiet area, defined by large private estates hidden behind thick trees. It's a neighborhood designed for privacy, which made it the place Francesco Cali chose to live. At 53, Cali was identified by law enforcement as the acting boss of the Gambino crime family. Unlike John Gotti, who'd spent 19 years wearing expensive suits and smiling for television cameras, Cali completely avoided that kind of attention. He kept his head down and lived quietly with his family on Staten Island. His wife and one of their children were inside that house that night. Outside, Cali's Cadillac SUV was parked in the street. The driver of the pickup truck shifted into reverse and backed directly into the Cadillac. Inside, Cali heard the crash. He opened his front door and walked down the driveway to look at the damage. The driver of the pickup stepped out, picked up the detached license plate from the pavement that fell off, and handed it directly to Cali. The two men stood in the dark and spoke briefly. They shook hands, and it looked like an ordinary exchange between two drivers dealing with a minor accident. Then Cali turned around and walked back toward his SUV. The driver of the truck pulled out a 9mm handgun and fired 12 shots, 10 of them striking Cali. As the pickup truck sped away, Cali's family rushed outside. Paramedics transported him to the Staten Island University Hospital, where he was then pronounced dead. Because of Cali's position, early reports raised the possibility of an internal Gambino conflict or a wider dispute between crime families. No New York crime family boss had been killed in the city since Paul Castellano was gunned down inside the Sparks Steakhouse in 1985. But several details immediately complicated that theory. The attack happened outside Cali's home, in front of multiple security cameras. The shooter also touched a broken license plate with his bare hands, and that fingerprint gave police their first direct lead. It linked investigators to Anthony Comello, a 24-year-old construction worker living with his parents on Staten Island. Using his phone data, police tracked Comello's movements and located the pickup truck. On March 16th, just 3 days after the shooting, officers and federal agents surrounded his family's home in Brick, New Jersey, and arrested him. Comello had no known mafia affiliation and no substantial criminal record, so the theory of a renewed mob war was immediately fractured. And in early reports, it suggested a personal motive, claiming Comello had developed an interest in one of Cali's nieces and that Cali disapproved. But while that theory circulated widely, it was never established as a fact. And the reality of what actually happened became more complicated once investigators sat down with Comello and listened to what he had to say. Following his arrest, detectives placed Comello in an interrogation room for a recorded 3.5-hour interview. And instead of a clear motive, he offered a chaotic stream of explanations. He claimed the Central Intelligence Agency had infiltrated the mafia, and that the government was monitoring him. He told detectives that he kept his phone inside a copper bag to protect it from military satellites. At another point, he laid out a sprawling theory connecting Democratic political operatives directly to the Mexican drug trafficker El Chapo. While describing the shooting itself, he told investigators, "I was scared, I was jumpy, and I was high." And even more explanations followed. He claimed that he had gone to Cali's home to warn him that other people wanted him dead. In another, he said unidentified individuals had blackmailed him into carrying out the shooting. And obviously, none of these stories fit cleanly with the others, leaving investigators without a single coherent reason for why the Staten Island construction worker had targeted a Gambino boss. But just 2 days later, Comello gave the public its first real look inside his mind. On March 18th, Camelo appeared at a hearing at Toms River in New Jersey. As photographers focused on him inside the courtroom, he deliberately raised his left hand and turned his palm outward. Written across his skin in blue ink were the phrases, "MAGA forever, united we stand MAGA, patriots in charge." At the center was a large Q-like symbol associated with QAnon. QAnon was built around an anonymous internet post written by someone calling himself Q, who claimed to process secret government intelligence, and followers believe those posts described a hidden conflict between President Trump and a criminal network operating inside the government. Camelo's family had noticed political changes in him after the 2016 election. He began an Instagram account that filled with screenshots of Q drops, clips of President Trump, and material featuring Fox News personalities. Camelo became increasingly vocal about QAnon in roughly 6 weeks leading up to the shooting. He came to believe that Q was communicating secret information directly to him, and that he'd been selected to participate in a hidden campaign against the deep state. But crucially, there was no verified Q post that explained Camelo specifically connecting Francisco Cali to the deep state. That appears to have been a conclusion Camelo reached himself. And this wasn't entirely coming out of nowhere. Camelo had already tried an act of unusual political beliefs weeks before he drove to Hilltop Terrace. In February 2019, about a month before Kelly's death, Camelo went to Gracie Mansion, intending to place New York Mayor Bill de Blasio under citizen's arrest for supposed election fraud, but security simply turned him away. Later, he went to a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan because he believed Representatives Maxine Waters and Adam Schiff were inside. Camelo also approached the United States Marshal Service and calmly asked for their help in arresting the 2 members of Congress, as he genuinely believed those politicians were actively trying to destroy the country. These failed attempts showed that Camelo had a pattern of acting on political conspiracies. He was actively looking for a target to arrest. His focus expanded beyond politicians to now include organized crime. On April 24th, 2019, Camelo was indicted on 1 count of second-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree weapon possession. He pleaded not guilty, and his attorneys began preparing a mental disease or defect defense. And the reality of who Camelo had killed also hung over the proceedings, that there were serious threats against him, so Camelo's lawyer requested protective custody. And in July, the defense argued that Camelo never went to Hilltop Terrace to kill anyone. According to his attorneys, he arrived carrying a pair of handcuffs because he intended to detain Cali and deliver him to the military. The collision with the Cadillac was meant to draw Cali outside, where Camelo would announce a citizen's arrest and order him to submit. But the conversation grew heated, and when Cali allegedly made a sudden movement with his hand, Camelo claimed he panicked, grabbed his 9mm and fired. But there was no evidence that Cali was actually armed. And as for the murder weapon, it was never recovered. But in June 2020, Camelo was found mentally unfit to proceed, and he was transferred to a mental health facility for further evaluation. Years would pass, and the case seemingly froze. In May 2024, a suspicious fire heavily damaged Camelo's childhood home in Staten Island, and the blaze sparked immediate rumors of Gambino retaliation, although authorities publicly connected the fire to no person or group. And then finally, in January 2025, Camelo had pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a prison sentence. The exact length of the sentence, the terms of the plea deal, and his current location were entirely withheld from the public, as this was to protect him from multiple threats against Camelo and his family. And in the end, the clearest documented explanation came from Camelo's defense. By early 2019, he had been consumed by QAnon's post and appears to have believed that they had given him a role in something much larger than his own life. And with that imagined conflict, confronting Francisco Cali may have felt significant, an act that would prove he was helping expose the deep state. But Camelo never provided one coherent explanation for why Cali became his target. All the explanations contradicted one another, and none of them fully explained why Francisco Cali became the center of Camelo's imagined mission. By that point, Camelo had spent weeks treating anonymous posts as secret intelligence and appears to see himself as the chosen one to act on them. At the end of February 2021, 26-year-old Samantha Hartsoe returned home from a hiking trip. She lived with 2 roommates in a 3-bedroom apartment in Roosevelt Landings, a massive residential complex on Roosevelt Island in New York City. Even with the apartment's heat running, her bathroom always felt unusually cold. She stood near the sink and felt a concentrated steam of air blowing across her face. It was strong enough to even move her hair, and as she looked around for an open vent or a cracked window, there was nothing but walls that were completely solid. The draft was seemingly coming from directly behind her bathroom mirror. On March 1st, she decided to investigate. She reached out and touched the glass. The mirror was not anchored into the wall. It shifted easily in its frame, so Samantha lifted it up and pulled it away. Behind the glass, there was a large, rectangular opening cut directly into the drywall. It looked like the empty space where a recessed medicine cabinet used to sit. Thick electrical wires crossed the gap, and beyond the wires, the opening continued directly into a dark room. She picked up her phone and started recording. She ended up posting a 4-part series to TikTok titled A New York Mystery. The original video eventually passed over 14 million views, largely because it captured a quiet universal fear of discovering your home is not actually sealed off from the outside world, and that something was hiding in plain sight the entire time. Her roommate stood in the bathroom with her and looked through the hole in the wall. They advised her against going inside, but the opening was just wide enough to fit through, and she wanted to know what was on the other side. Samantha put on a face mask, strapped a flashlight to her head using a hairband, picked up a hammer for protection, and climbed up onto the bathroom counter. She navigated past the exposed wiring and dropped down. She looked back toward the opening. The drop was too high for her to easily pull herself back up through the small gap, and her only practical option was to walk through the unknown space to try to find its front door. As she moved her flashlight around, she realized this was not a single hidden room. It was an entire 3-bedroom apartment. The windows had been left wide open, which explained the freezing air blowing directly into her bathroom. The space was completely gutted, with the flooring ripped up and bare pipes hanging loose from the ceiling. She walked past a disconnected bathroom without any working toilet or bathtub. Then her flashlight caught a pile of garbage bags that made her wonder whether someone had been inside recently. But as she moved carefully through the rest of the rooms, she found no one. The apartment was stripped for construction and entirely uninhabitable. She found the apartment's normal entrance, stepped into another hallway, and locked the door behind her. By March 3rd, her videos were spreading rapidly across the internet. Roosevelt Landings contains over 1,000 apartments spread across 6 buildings, and other residents began seeing the footage on their phones. This made other residents try the same thing, pulling off their bathroom mirror, but they didn't find anything. Building management finally addressed the situation. The apartment was not a forgotten residence. The unit next to Samantha's was simply undergoing renovations. The opening had been created during renovation work and had not been properly closed. And the building staff officially sealed it up after Samantha reported the discovery. And one strange final coincidence that made the story almost feel scripted was that Roosevelt Landings was properly known as Eastwood and 540 Main Street. One of the buildings in the complex had been used during the filming of the 2005 horror movie Dark Water. In that movie, a mother and a daughter move into a deteriorating apartment on Roosevelt Island. Dark water begins leaking through their ceiling, while noises seem to be supposedly coming from a vacant apartment above them. The problem eventually leads to the discovery of a young girl who had died inside the building's rooftop water tank. The movie does not contain a passage through a bathroom mirror, but the similarity was difficult to ignore. Samantha's story had an ordinary explanation. She had not discovered a squatter, a deliberate hidden room, or anything supernatural. At the end of the day, it was simply an empty 3-bedroom apartment, stripped down and left unused while renovations were underway. The explanation solved the mystery, but did not make the situation feel normal. For an unknown amount of time, an opening large enough for a person to climb through had connected the unfinished apartment directly to Samantha's bathroom, and the only thing concealing it from her was a mirror that wasn't even anchored to the wall. And if the apartment's windows had never been left open, the cold air would have never reached her bathroom. and she might have never moved her mirror, and the opening could have remained there, only inches away without her ever knowing it ever existed. Just after 2 a.m. on May 29, 2026, the intersection of McDonald Avenue and Carlin Place in Gravesend, Brooklyn is relatively quiet. Then, in the middle of the street, a heavy metal manhole cover begins to move from underneath. The cover slides aside. One person climbs out of the darkness and onto the street, followed by another, until at least 7 people are standing around the open hole, some wearing headlamps, several carry bags, flashlights, and what appears to be small shovels. Beside the parked cars, they remove the solid outer layers, clean themselves off, and load their equipment into the vehicles before driving away. If this incident had been an isolated event, it may have been written off as a bizarre anomaly, but this wasn't isolated. At the opposite end of Brooklyn, Williamsburg 365 reported an incident. On the morning of May 28th, 3 people were seen emerging from a manhole at Bedford Avenue and Lynn Street before entering a white van, and their entry point was unknown. The following night brought a larger operation. Around 1 a.m., at least 7 people descended into the sewer system at the intersection of Bedford Avenue and Hayward Street. Williamsburg 365 reported they emerged into the Bedford Avenue and Lynn Street about 2.5 hours later, where another white van collected them. And during the exit, one member of the group reportedly surfaced directly into traffic and narrowly avoided a passing vehicle. Once the Brooklyn footage started going viral, a man named Aki Jakupovich realized he had seen something similar weeks earlier. On May 5th, Aki was working a late shift in his auto shop in Astoria, Queens. Looking onto 20th Avenue and 36th Street at around 2 a.m., he watched 3 men approach a manhole, and just like the groups in Brooklyn, they were prepared, wearing the same attire, carrying flashlights, and an idling car positioned nearby to illuminate the road. Aki briefly made eye contact with the men as they opened the cover, climbed down, and slid it back in place behind them. He would close the garage doors while an employee contacted police, but he never learned what happened to them once they vanished below the street. The footage immediately produced jokes about mole people and the Ninja Turtles, alongside speculation that the groups are searching for treasure or attempting to reach a nearby property. But the reality of what is beneath New York is far more grounded and far more dangerous. New York contains more than 7,400 miles of sewer pipes. Much of that network cannot be walked through comfortably, and according to a man named Steve Duncan, a former urban explorer who spoke to the Associated Press, the groups in the footage appeared to have done their homework, noting that their early morning timing would have placed them underground when wastewater was lower. But preparation only goes so far. The environment they willingly walked into is extremely hazardous. Hydrogen sulfide and other noxious gases can build up and render a person unconscious without warning. Sudden rain can cause rapid flooding. The physical toll is also extremely hard. Duncan himself was hospitalized twice with serious infections from his own underground explorations, experiences that eventually caused him to stop. So why are there multiple groups risking their lives for a midnight walk through the sewers? Following the viral videos, NYPD Emergency Service unit officers and Department of Environmental Protection crews inspected the 2 Brooklyn sewer locations. They reported no damage to the sewer infrastructure and nothing indicating an immediate threat to the public. The people in the footage arrived in vehicles, brought specialized clothing, remained underground for a few hours, and left. Nothing in the footage suggested that they were living underground. For investigators and the public, 2 explanations dominated the credible reporting. The first is urban exploration, but the modern exploration community was divided on this. Many NYC urban explorers said they did not recognize anyone in the footage, and the other leading explanation was law enforcement's main working theory, that it was treasure hunting. And surprisingly, treasure hunting beneath New York has a genuine history behind it. In 2015, 3 men were caught entering a sewer, and according to police, they had been searching for valuables, including gold, jewelry, and guns. A decade later, in April 2025, Security cameras captured 5 people wearing neon vests and carrying tools. 4 entered the manhole while the 5th remained above. Police would arrest 3 of them. None of them worked for the city, and one would tell the officers that they were looking for treasure. But as of today, no one connecting to the sightings have been publicly identified or arrested. And what cannot be explained was who had spent hours beneath the streets, and exactly what they had been looking for. And what it leaves is very strange videos of men going underground for no apparent reason.